welcome to this first episode of our new podcast series entitled On Progress with the Tudors Uncut. No doubt, if you've listened to the introductory episode, you'll know what this podcast is all about. However, for those of you who haven't, just let me take a moment to recap. This is an exciting adventure for Natalie and I. We are going to be sharing with you the writing of a new book. In real time, we're calling it our docubook. Let me explain what I mean. In this book, we're going to recreate some of the most interesting and notable progresses and journeys of the Tudor era. And we're going to be following some of the biggest and most well-known characters of the Tudor age, such as Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Elizabeth of York, Catherine of Aragon, Edward VI, Mary I, and finally, Mary Queen of Scots. That's quite a roll call, I'm sure you'll agree. And along the way, we're going to be visiting the places that they stayed in and doing our very best to recreate them as they would have been at the time. Now, as with the In the Footsteps books, if you're familiar with those books, the On the Progress with the Tudors will be a book which is both part academic and part travelogue. So you can either choose to read it from the comfort of your own armchair, or you can take it with you on your own Tudor progress. And yet, what makes this endeavour so different is that, as I have just mentioned, we're going to be sharing the research with you as it unfolds. So, in each podcast, Natalie and I are going to be discussing the 2 locations that are under review at a time. And we'll be talking about the context of those locations as part of the progress in question. And of course, diving into all those sources, primary, secondary sources that describe the context of the visit and the places themselves. It's going to be research in the raw. And so in this spirit, it's likely that we'll be sharing with you both our triumph and our troubles, our exciting discoveries and the many dead ends that we'll no doubt be coming across as we go along. And what we discuss here, of course, may or may not make it into the final book. That's all part of the thrill of it being written and this podcast being recorded as we go. But we are, however, asking you to participate. We'd love you to share your thoughts about the things you might have found out, questions you might have, or indeed any images of the places that are under discussion. And it may be that you even have a chance to change the course of our research. So yes, we want this to be a collaborative adventure. We will tell you more about how you can go about doing that at the end of the podcast. But for now, ready your horse, because it's time to go time travelling. The first progress of Henry VII, the dawn of the Tudor era. So before I get going, I obviously want to welcome my partner in crime, Natalie Grueninger. Hi, Natalie.
Hello, Sarah. So lovely to be chatting with you again.
Once again, here we go on our next adventure. It's exciting times, isn't it?
Oh, so exciting.
So what we're going to do is going to be diving into 2 locations today. But before we get going with those 2 locations, I'd really love to ask you something and talk about something a little more general, actually. And I know that both of us have had that experience of having, how can I put it, certain preconceived ideas about various Tudor characters that we've written about in our In the Footsteps books, and I know that is certainly true for me. And Anne of Cleves, I think, stands out as the primary example. I mean, you know, she's been subject to so much propaganda, and I guess her marriage to Henry was, you know, associated with relatively little drama, you know, stepping aside quite quietly and submissively to be the king's sister. I think when I set about writing about her, I thought I would meet somebody who was, well, quite frankly, a bit dull and uninteresting. But, you know, I mean, how wrong was I? You know, I found this woman who was generous, kind, warm-hearted, and just somebody I thought, you know what? I'd love to just sit down and have a cup of coffee with her and a chat, you know? She completely swept me off my feet, and I have to confess I've had a bit of a crush on her ever since. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, and I actually remember you often emailing me saying something like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe this woman. She's incredible." And it was so great to actually get that sort of perspective on her. But I actually found a similar thing with Catherine Howard. In doing some of the research, because obviously Catherine's often portrayed as like promiscuous and frivolous, but I don't think that's a completely fair assessment. I don't think I ever came across anything to suggest that she didn't actually take her role as queen seriously, queen consort. Mm-hmm. And we know that she was very kind and perhaps a little too trusting. But I think she did the best that she could with the education that she had, because I think sometimes we forget that she wasn't raised to be a queen consort and she didn't have the same upbringing as someone, say, like Catherine of Aragon, for example. So, so it is interesting how it sort of changes as you start doing the research. So we're obviously at the moment immersed in the world of Henry VII. So what are your feelings about Henry VII? Do you have any sort of, or did you before you started, have any preconceptions about him?
Oh, yes, I did. I confess. So, So when I first, we decided who we were going to be writing about, and we decided we really wanted to do something on Henry VII. And, the first thing I thought was, well, I've never really focused too much on him before. You and I have done a lot of writing about Henry VIII, haven't we, and his queen consort. So it was a bit of uncharted territory. And, if I think about how I felt before I started, I was trying to think, how did I see him? And he definitely came up as that kind of wise uncle figure, the person the person whose advice you should probably listen to, but at the same time is just a little teeny weeny bit of a killjoy. I guess that's supposedly largely fueled by the accounts of how he managed his son Henry, wrapped him up in cotton wool, and compared to Henry, let's face it, he's not particularly sexy or glamorous character. Well, at least not on first glance, first impressions can be deceptive, and I was really intrigued to find out, whether those preconceptions would just be blown apart. And I know even, before I opened that first book to start the research, I had that tingling feeling of excitement, just thinking, okay, who am I going to meet on this journey? And so,
absolutely.
That's kind of where I'm at. But what, are you similar or feel differently about him?
No, I think I'm pretty much exactly the same. So like you, obviously, I've been caught up in Henry VIII's reign. And to be honest, I didn't really stop to think about his father very much, which is a bit naughty of me. And yes, a lot of what I know about him as well comes from very late in his reign. So he's always kind of like an old man in my mind. Like I never picture Henry, the 28-year-old returning to claim his crown type thing. I'm always picturing the sort of deathbed scene, I suppose. So, and yeah, you're right. Compared to his charismatic young son at that point, he appears a little bit more boring. Sorry. But I'm really excited. I know that's all just preconceptions, and I'm really excited to get to know what kind of man he was. Not so much, the public persona, but also what kind of man was he behind closed doors.
So why don't we start exploring? Let's get into the next section. It is February 1486. England is still reeling from the end of the Wars of the Roses. The cries from the Battle of Bosworth of both triumph and disaster, and of agony and ecstasy, are still ringing in people's ears. The House of York has fallen, and its new Tudor king, Henry VII, has returned Lancaster to the throne. When Henry returned to London on the 3rd of September 1485, following the decisive battle, he was received through the city with great pomp and triumph, and travelled to the Cathedral of St Paul's, where he offered up his 3 standards. London welcomed the new king with open arms, with plays, pastimes and pleasures. Through religious ceremonies, the city demonstrated to their new king their rejoicing in his glorious victory by which God had delivered them. However, this did not mean the whole of England had acquiesced to the king's new reign. Henry VII knew that there were pockets of discontent which grumbled about his kingdom. York, for example, had been loyal to the late King Richard III, while some of Richard's closest friends and allies still remained at liberty and threatened the stability of the new reign. As a result, in the words of the chronicler Edward Hall, Henry thought it best to go up on a great peregrination and take his progress into the quarters of the realm might weed, extirpate and purge the minds of men spotted and contaminate with the contagious smoke of dissension, especially in the county of York. And so the scene is set for us to travel alongside king and court, retracing Henry VII's footsteps as he went on progress to the north. Whilst the king travelled from London to York and back again via the likes of Worcester, Hereford and Bristol, we will be focusing our attention on the outbound journey, which began in London at the Priory of St John of Jerusalem and ended with the king's arrival in York. From London to Waltham Abbey. Location 1, the Priory of St John of Jerusalem. So before we set the scene, before departing from London, Natalie, why don't you remind us of a few key dates associated with the early months of Henry VII's reign?
All right, I'd love to. Thank you. So, the Battle of Bosworth was fought on the 22nd of August, 1485. Interestingly, a bit of a side note here, Henry later backdated his reign to the day before, effectively rendering all those who'd fought for Richard, their crowned sovereign, obviously at the time, traitors.
That's harsh.
It's a nice way to start your reign, isn't it? So less than 2 weeks later, Henry was received at Shoreditch by the city's representatives before, as you've already mentioned, Sarah, proceeding to St Paul's, where he deposited the 3 banners. Presumably, these are the very banners that he'd used at Bosworth. If only we still had them. I don't think
wouldn't that be wonderful?
That would be good. So as we've already heard, London was ready to embrace their new monarch, but nevertheless, Henry was in no mood to let the proverbial grass grow under his feet. He had a kingdom to secure. He was crowned on the 30th of October of that same year and opened Parliament just 1 week later. It soon set about confirming the legitimacy of Henry's claim to the throne, passing various acts and detainers, and importantly, rewarding the king's supporters with grants, honours and appointments to offices. In the new year of 1486, on the 30th of January, Henry married Elizabeth of York at Westminster Abbey. By March of the same year, just 2 months later, the king probably felt that his capital was secure enough to turn his attention to managing some of the disquiet and unrest associated with various northern parts of his realm. On the 15th of February 1486, in a letter penned by Sir Thomas Bettinson, we hear of Henry's purpose in undertaking his northern progress. He writes, "The king proposeth northward hastily after the Parliament, and it is said he proposes to do execution quickly there on such as have offended against him."
Yes, so you certainly get a feel that Henry VII at this point was a man on a mission, probably had been for most of his adult life, but here we get the sense that he's beginning to reenact his regal role to perfection in those first few months, this kind of powerful combination of decisiveness, ruthlessness to his enemies, and yet kindness to those he wished to bind him in loyalty, really. And then there was this whole thing about, this pious observation of religious ritual, which his predecessors had done before him and seemed to be so much a part of trying to establish himself and saying, look, here I am, a legitimate king. So he was really sort of dutifully enacting, I suppose, all those customs associated with the King of England. He was saying, here I am, I'm the man for the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so at the beginning of this progress, he sets off from the Priory of St John in the city of London. And, I have to confess, when we put the original list together, I was like, where? I'd never even heard of it before. And you see, research and learning is never over in this field. Never. I have to confess, I know nothing of the place. And however, I do know enough about London and English history to have had the thought that it sounded like something to do with the Knights Templar. I mean, is that right? What can you tell us about this place? In particular, why did Henry VII bring his progress there?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's do a little background first, and then I'll get to that towards the end.
Okay.
So you were very close, Sarah. You were very close. It was actually the English headquarters of the Knights Hospitallers.
Ah.
So, a religious order who, like the Templars, though, adopted a military role after the capture of Jerusalem in 1099. However, their origins actually go back even further. We know that by 1080, a group of monks had established a hospital that was attached to the Benedictine Abbey of St Mary. And I think this is pronounced of the Latins, I'm not 100% sure, but it was in the old city of Jerusalem. So there they cared for the poor and the many pilgrims who became ill while on their travels to the Holy Land.
I see.
What was great about this community is that they cared for anyone, regardless of their race or their faith. Then this new order was officially recognised by the Pope in around 1113. And it's at around this time that we actually see the first establishments of the order in Europe. Yeah, primarily in major ports of embarkation for pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. So these included places like Asti and Pisa in Italy and St Gilles in the south of France.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So sometime around or before actually 1179, the Priory of France was established. And in the 1180s, the English Priory is recognised as a separate entity, although it was already established in London from around 1144. Right. So I think it's really important to understand that the Priory of St John is not a traditional priory. It's not the priories that you and I have looked at before.
Yeah, okay.
Which made it a little bit challenging because I had to sort of get my head around this. But it's the provincial headquarters of a military religious order. So an order that from the get-go received a number of privileges from the Pope. Now, importantly, their members were exempt from the authority of the local ordinaries and enjoyed extensive rights of sanctuary. And the priors, this is key here, owed no fealty to the temporal authority. So in other words,
that meant yes, they...
Yeah, in other words, that they answered to the master, who was... the master wasn't in England, he was in Europe, who was the head of the entire order, and ultimately they answered only to the Pope.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so exactly. Mm-hmm. So they were also required to pay an annual, I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly, responsion, I think it is, to their convent. It's basically an annual payment, which was the convent was the name given to the order's headquarters, which was always located in the East, never in Europe.
Okay.
So at the time of Henry VII's accession, it was in Rhodes. It had previously been in Jerusalem, and it moved a couple of times. The last place was Malta. Originally, this payment that they had to do every year represented the prior's entire annual income after the deduction of expenses. But this was a bit sort of flexible and later changed to about a third of their net income. So I'm sure that by now you're sort of seeing how all of this could cause this undercurrent of tension. And really complicate the relationship. And it did a lot of the time. Yeah. So what we start seeing in the 14th century, the Crown tries to impose its sovereignty on the priory by making a newly appointed prior take the oath of fealty. And this later becomes normal procedure for the newly elected priors, even though they were never happy about it. So by the time of the Tudor reign, the priory was pretty much not independent anymore. Even though they wanted to be, and I suppose theoretically they still were, they had sworn loyalty to the king.
Okay. So the king had won out eventually.
Eventually. They were trying for like hundreds of years, yeah. So members of the order, it's such an interesting order. I've been really enjoying finding out about it. So members of the order took the same vows as monks, so vows of poverty, obedience and chastity, but there was a fourth vow, the vow to honour our Lord's sick. So because they were a military order and they were actually defenders of Christendom, their daily lives were really different to members of other more traditional monastic orders. So your role within the order dictated what canonical hours you were required to observe. So you didn't have to observe all the same hours as other monastic houses. Mm-hmm. And apart from, I suppose, tending to your spiritual needs, the knights also trained and worked in the hospital. So we know that the brethren at various times, and I suppose it depends the century, but they practiced gymnastics. They practiced
way!
They practiced arms training, of course, and crossbow shooting. So they were very active, and they did this a few afternoons every week. Yeah, and then they worked in the hospital as well. So the order's house at Clerkenwell, this is the one we're talking about for our book. This is where Henry set out from.
Yeah.
He's to have been founded in around 1144, as I mentioned, during the reign of King Stephen. It was founded on about 10 acres of land, really between 5 and 10. I've read a few different things. Granted to the order by Jordan de Brisset and his wife Muriel. They were Lord and Lady of Clerkenwell Manor. And these same people actually also founded the Nunnery of St Mary, which was situated to the north of the Priory. So St John's was situated a little way outside of the London city walls, not far from another religious house, the Priory of St Bartholomew in Smithfield, known in those times as Smoothfield, and they used to have jousts there. In the late 14th century, a fourth religious house was established in the area, and that's the Charter House that I know you know, and we've both visited.
I do indeed know it well.
Yeah, with who the Priory actually enjoyed very close ties.
Right.
So this is all within walking distance. Yeah. This is just one suburb full of these religious houses. And it was also interestingly positioned next to two major livestock markets. So there was Le Cow Market and Smithfield. To the west was the River Fleet, and to the south was the city. So the position was very important. It was a very obviously good position close to the seat of government as well. So if we fast forward a bit to around 14th of March, 1486, this is the day when Henry VII, nobly accompanied, as we hear, departs for Waltham from the Priory of St John of Jerusalem. Now, we know that this was actually not the king's first visit to the Priory. I was so excited to find this out.
Okay.
So this was not his first visit.
It's amazing what you find when you dig, isn't it?
I love it, yeah. The court had actually been in residence in early March. And we know that because there are several letters written and dated from the Priory. Now, the prior at the time was a man called John Weston. Despite him having enjoyed, a pretty good relationship with Richard III, he appears to have been eager to pledge his allegiance to the new king. So in early 1486, he was one of 8 men chosen to testify to the degree of Henry VII's blood relationship with his future bride, Elizabeth of York. Weston stated that he'd known the Yorkist princess for 10 years, and I love this, and the king since the 24th of August 1485. So this is only 2 days, obviously, after Henry had won his crown at Bosworth. So I'm sort of thinking, well, either Weston had either left London the second he heard that Henry had become king to reach there in time, or he was already hanging around Bosworth at the time, waiting to see what was going to happen and trying to,
hedge his bets.
Exactly. So earlier you asked, why did Henry begin his progress from here? Well, I'm going to be completely honest, there's really no definitive answer. However, we can do a bit of conjecturing here about his motives.
Okay.
At the time of Henry's accession, the Knights Hospitallers were already an ancient order. They had land, they had money, and important European connections, not to mention the support of the Pope. Now, as we've already heard, they weren't your average religious order. They were also a military order. And after the Knights Templar was dissolved, the Hospitallers received some of their property and monetary assets. So they actually get quite a big injection of cash and houses at that time. In the past, they'd undertaken financial and diplomatic business on behalf of the monarch, and in return, the monarch extended them royal patronage. Now, Henry had no reason to change this at all. In fact, he was probably keen to garner their support. Also, let's not forget that Henry required a papal dispensation in order to marry Elizabeth. As we've already noted, Prior John Weston was one of 8 men selected to testify to Henry's blood relationship with her. So the result of this was a papal dispensation that, among other things, threatened excommunication to all who should rebel against Henry VII and his heirs. So you touched on it before, that we see Henry continuing much of what had taken place beforehand. So he's not trying to come in and change everything. He's actually saying, look, I am a monarch like the previous ones, and I'm going to continue these things. So he went on to establish a very amicable relationship with the priors of St John's.
Yeah, and I can also see how he would like to affiliate himself with an organisation which has cash and influence. That sounds like Henry VII to me.
It does. And, sometimes I think we forget that he was 14 when he left England, when he was forced to leave England, and he spent 14 years in exile on the continent, virtually as a sort of, I say guest, but really it's more a prisoner. So, and we might have this image of him, spending the whole time with his uncle Jasper, But no, they were together for a while, but they were separated for long periods. So Henry was a little unprepared for the role of king. So he's come home and he's looking for people that are established, that know what they're doing, that were loyal to the previous monarchs, that sort of thing. So it's so interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting. So I think both of us, when we kind of, going back to when we first put our list together, kind of looked at the available evidence and thought, I think it was about, for both of us, both for this location and the one we're going to be speaking about shortly, Waltham, there was like a sentence.
Yeah, literally.
And we were thinking, how on earth are we going to write an entry based on one sentence? So you've obviously found out a lot of information already, but I'm curious to know how you went about researching the place. What kind of sources did you use, and what have you uncovered? What are the things you'd really like to share with us today?
No, that's a great question. And I think before we started recording, we were having a good laugh about the fact that we had one sentence. So we know they were there. They were definitely there. Now, obviously, we know they'd been there before. But from one sentence has led us to a huge amount of information. But I want to begin by saying that this is still a work in progress. I'm not at the end of it yet. I'm still immersed in the research and writing, and I am really enjoying it a lot. I've referred to lots of different sources, but I suppose one that's been absolutely indispensable is a 400-plus page account of the excavations of the Priory by the Museum of London Archaeology Service. I think it's sort of popularly known as MOLA.
Yeah. That
took place between 1986 and 1995. Now, this is huge.
I was going to say that must be some interesting bedtime reading for you there.
Oh, my goodness. Honestly. Yeah, I have to lay it out on the desk, and it's this huge thing. So I'm still sifting through this, but this has been amazing. It draws on both archaeological and documentary evidence to paint a very detailed picture of the development of the Priory of the centuries. It changed a lot. There was a lot going on, so it's absolutely fantastic. I've also found a book by Gregory O'Malley called The Knights Hospitallers of the English Lang, very useful. And I've also referred to things like A History of the County of Middlesex, which was published in the 19th century, which we've used previously, and A Survey of London, both of which can be very conveniently accessed at British History Online, which is always great. Then there are, of course, the state papers from Henry's reign, 16th century surveys, letters, and of course, in terms of the progress as a whole, and we were referring to this one line in this document, the contemporary account of Henry's progress to the north, which was written by one of his officers at arms. And I also love the York House books because they record the pageantry that was prepared for the king. So this is just, my goodness, just a sample, just a tip of the iceberg, really.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And in sifting... And in sifting through all that, what about the building itself? What can you tell us of what the building actually looked like? What would have Henry seen?
Yeah, this is exactly what the picture that I'm trying, and it's starting to build in my mind. And you probably know how this happens. You start off, you can't imagine it.
Yeah.
It's really difficult. And then suddenly it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Yes. It starts coming together and you go, oh my gosh, I can sort of see it now. Yeah. So it is difficult to reconstruct with any certainty because only a few traces of the building survive today. There's a magnificent 16th century gatehouse and a equally stunning 12th century crypt. So this is all in Clerkenwell. What we do know is that the priory precincts were divided into a sort of inner monastic precinct and an outer, more secular court.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And an outer gatehouse gave access to the outer court, where from the 14th century onwards, it seemed to be a place of accommodation for like officials and important members of the priory and guests and that sort of thing. And there were some pretty fancy houses built in that area.
Right.
So basically, if you're visiting London today, where St John Lane and St John Street meet today, roughly there once stood the outer gatehouse. And if you walk up St John Lane towards where the Museum of the Order of St John is, which is actually partly housed in what was once the Priory's inner gatehouse.
Okay.
It's a beautiful 16th century gatehouse. You're walking through the outer precinct. So you can imagine there the nice houses of the tenants that live there. And so, yeah.
I'm seeing it. It's
right? It'll be easier in the book when we can have have an image. Yes. That's going to be great. But once you're in the inner precinct, so if you were visiting and you were in the inner part now, you were met by a complex of very large halls and chambers and gardens, perhaps, to be honest, only the large church and all its multiple chapels and the burial ground actually reminded you that you were in fact in a religious house and not in an aristocratic mansion.
Okay.
So cloisters stood on the south side of the church, and to the north was situated the great chamber and a prior's hall. To the west there was a great hall, there was kitchens and dormitory. There's actually a fantastic survey that was conducted at the time of the dissolution, so that the priory was eventually dissolved.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that bit. It was eventually dissolved, and they conducted a survey. So this is later. So a lot of these things appeared after Henry's initial visit, but still, we can sort of get a sense of it. At the time of the dissolution, it mentions an armoury, a distillery, a counting house. There's a schoolhouse, and adjoining it, there's a great and a little court. The priory also boasted an orchard, fish ponds, conduits, water pipes and springs, among other sort of domestic buildings as well. So there was without doubt high status, palatial-like accommodation at the priory, because for centuries they'd been welcoming powerful religious and royal entourages. Among its illustrious list of visitors are Henry II, King John, Prince Edward and his wife Eleanor of Castile, and Richard III, and this is to name just a few.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the latter, I just recently found this out, and it's very interesting. The latter, so Richard, chose the Great Hall of the Priory as the setting for one of the most important events of his reign. I don't know how many people know this. There he assembled the mayor and the citizens of London to refute the rumours that he was planning to marry Elizabeth, his niece, which then went on to marry Henry.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I certainly didn't know that. I'm really loving hearing about this. That's amazing.
Yeah, I got really excited when I saw that. I was like, whoa, that's fun.
Another piece of the jigsaw falls into place. So there's, I can see that in my mind, probably partly helped by poring over lots and lots and lots of descriptions of abbeys and priories.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But I can certainly see that's really interesting. But I'm also wondering about where you are in your research at the moment, whether you've got any gaps in your knowledge about the location, if there's something you'd really like to find out still about the building or about the progress.
I suppose I'd love a contemporary plan of I know I'm asking a lot here, a contemporary plan of the buildings, or a painting or a drawing or something, because we know, I suppose, what buildings were there, but we're not always certain about where they were positioned. So you kind of just got to imagine in your mind. Some of them now, thankfully, after all this archaeology's been done there, now you can sort of, piece it together bit by bit. But it's quite a jigsaw puzzle to put together. So, a contemporary plan would be absolutely incredible. We've got some lovely reconstructions that we've already found, but of course something from the time would be wonderful. In terms of the progress, the 1486 progress, I'd also love to know if there are any other contemporary references to this particular visit. We've mentioned we found one, but perhaps there's others, I don't know. So far, I've only found one reference. I'd also love to know exactly where the court was lodged during the stay. Now, you and I are always obsessed with these things. We want to know exactly where it was so we can go and stand there, even if it's in the middle of a busy London road. We get run over or something, but we're like, doesn't matter, we're standing where Henry stood. Yeah. So, we've done it before at several places, stood in a park looking at trees or stood...
Yeah.
So, that would be incredible. At this point, I know there were high status apartments there. I know it's likely connected to the prior's lodgings. I don't know for certain.
It's interesting because that brings up a question for me, which certainly is something that pertains to the research I've done with Waltham Abbey. And that's the question of, were there permanent royal apartments kept there on standby, or were they just, was the abbot or the prior turfed out to allow the king and queen to lodge whenever they happen to be passing by? That's kind of that's very much at the forefront of my mind, as we'll hear at the moment, because it's certainly the case with Waltham. But so I suppose the question then is, how could our listeners help us? Maybe there's somebody out there who has a particular interest in this location. Maybe you've researched it before. Maybe you have some information or knowledge about what Natalie was asking about that could be of relevance to the progress. And at the end, we'll tell you about how you can share that information with us if you'd like to. And although it's the first time we're asking, it certainly won't be the last.
No, I don't
because
think so.
As we said right up at the front, we really, really would like this to be a collaborative event if we can. So good. Anything you'd like to add there, Nat?
Yeah, so just saying, basically echoing what you just said, I'd love to hear from anyone out there who has a particular interest in the Priory, or maybe you just feel like doing a little bit of research after this. I don't know, maybe we've inspired you. And we know from past experience that local knowledge is absolutely indispensable. It's happened to us time and time again where we've known nothing. We've looked and we've thought, well, we've read everything that there is in books, and then we've met somebody or we've managed to contact a historical society, and suddenly there's somebody that has all this incredible information. So, fingers crossed that could happen in this situation. So if this is you, or if you know someone, or even if you've got questions, even if you've heard something and you've thought, oh, I just want to ask something about that, I encourage you to join in the discussion by just joining us on the members group on Facebook. So you just search On Progress with the Tudors, and there's a group, and we're going to be chatting about all these things and discussing it. So please join us there.
Yeah, okay. And so don't worry if you didn't get that. We'll repeat all that information at the end of the podcast. But for now, let's go on to the second of our 2 locations for today, and that is Waltham Abbey in Essex.
So, Sarah, you've been researching our second location, which is Waltham Abbey in Essex. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the early history of Waltham and why it became associated so closely with the royal family.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really pertinent question because that association is really relevant to why the Tudors frequented Waltham so often. So when you start to research Waltham's Abbey's history, you see that it's got this really long, very ancient association with the English royal family. In fact, it goes back to the early 11th century, so that's before the Norman conquest even. It was founded by this Anglo-Danish thane called Tovie le Prude, or Tovie the Proud, and he was apparently the standard bearer to King Canute. And the whole kind of existence of Waltham Abbey is very much wrapped up in its association with the very famous Holy Cross. So the Holy Cross, or rood, was apparently made of wood. It was a cross made of wood and had carved upon it an image of Christ. And here's where the story starts. It was miraculously discovered in a vision that was given to a carpenter. This cross was on this top of this pointed hill in Montacute in Somerset. And at some point, it's a little bit convoluted, but anyway, this carpenter got Tovie involved. And my understanding is he had this cross placed upon this cart drawn by oxen, and tried to get the oxen to kind of go to various places, and they wouldn't budge. And then when he mentioned the name Waltham, the oxen just started to move of their own accord and took this cross all the way from Somerset to Essex. And if you're familiar with English geography, that's quite a way. These oxen went off and they arrived at Tovie's hunting lodge, which was basically on the edge of Epping Forest. There was only his hunting lodge there at the time. And of course, it was deemed that this cross had arrived there by a miracle. And so dutifully Tovie set up this very small convent upon the spot, and then established this small village, which initially was only 66 inhabitants. The cross basically became associated with these divine healing powers, and so it's not hard to see why it subsequently became a site of pilgrimage and veneration by not only kind of the general populace, but also by the kings and queens of England. And as a result of that, from the early medieval period, the abbey was patronised extensively by various members of the medieval English royal family, and so money poured into the church. The church became progressively enlarged over time, and eventually we had this enormous abbey, which was comparable in size to Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing. And if you actually go to Waltham and stand, there's only a small fraction of the abbey left, but if you go, you can see where the old abbey is traced into the grass. And if you go and stand at its most easterly end and kind of look back towards the church, you really get this feeling of, wow, this place was enormous. Anyway, so just to kind of round up that story, it's clear that royalty used Waltham Abbey regularly as a staging post and even a significant destination in its own right. And that was partly on account of this association with these miraculous healing powers of the Holy Cross, but on a much more pragmatic level, it was also, there was plentiful hunting in the adjacent Epping Forest, which, of course, greatly pleased early medieval and later Tudor royalty.
Fabulous. Yeah, well, we know the hunting grounds were very important. It was kind of like, do you have hunting ground? Yes. Okay, I'll come and stay with you. Yes, type thing.
Indeed. Yeah.
All right. So if we're thinking about Waltham in relation to London, sort of where's that and how would the king and court have gotten there from London?
So interestingly, there was two ways to reach Waltham. And the first that I'm going to talk about is really hard to envision if you go there today. But at one stage, still today, the Waltham Abbey is kind of is on the banks of the River Lee, and there are several tributaries that flows kind of near to or through the town. Now, most of those you can't actually see today because they're so small. But way back, certainly in Viking times, you could actually navigate a Viking boat right into the heart of Waltham Abbey.
Right,
so,
okay.
you know, these waterways were much bigger and very close to the Abbey complex. So, so you know, they could be navigated. And what I think is fascinating is actually if you trace the track of the River Lee downstream, it discharges itself into the River Thames at Woolwich, which, believe it or not, is right opposite Greenwich.
That's very handy.
Very handy. And bearing in mind, Greenwich obviously became popular, you know, in the early Tudor reign. It's not hard to see why the English royal family may have used that route of access. But in terms of the 1486 progress, you know, we know from that single line available to us that describes the king's visit to Waltham that he used the highway on that occasion. Okay. And maybe that's just because he wanted to be seen more. You know, this was all about being seen, wasn't it, at this crucial stage. And in fact, that highway was the main road leading from London to York. And it was essentially the old Roman road, Ermine Street. And it was about, basically, Waltham's about sort of 15 miles or so north of London.
Okay.
Right. And you know, of course, we know that 15 miles was about the maximum amount that the royal court would travel in a day, so that fits quite nicely. So let's imagine that Henry's left London, he's set off on the highway, he's travelled his 15 miles or so north, and eventually the royal cavalcade would have come across this magnificent stone monument, which was at a junction of the main highway and a branch road which ran off to the east for about a mile or so to reach Waltham Abbey. Now, this monument was one, and actually still is, because it's still there today, one of the 12 Eleanor crosses, which was erected by Edward I, you know, as a monument to his beloved wife Eleanor at the places that her body rested as the funeral cortege brought it back to London from the north. And just to by the by, because obviously I wanted to do a bit of research about the highway as well as Waltham, as those were the two bits of information that we had to go on. And there are actually some fantastic illustrations of the early cross. Now they're not you know, dating back to the 13th century, but they are much further back in time, before Waltham Cross became built up as a town. And you can see the Eleanor Cross in all its glory, just basically in the middle of the countryside, stuck on the side of a highway. And in fact, in one illustration, you can see the road to Waltham snaking off in the distance with this procession. Wow. And then in the distance, this little kind of edifice, which probably was the kind of the front of the Abbey church. So it's just possible that from that junction, you could have, in those times when it wasn't built up, you could have seen right the way through to the Abbey. So it would have been really impressive. But anyway, I went there a couple of days ago. Waltham Cross is now a town. The Eleanor Cross is in a shopping precinct. Pedestrianised shopping precinct surrounded by sort of 50s and 60s architecture, and you certainly can't see Waltham Abbey from there. Anyway, so we have to imagine the cavalcade snaking its way off to lodge at Waltham Abbey.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, that you brought up about the fact that obviously now we can't see too much further than one place because of all the buildings, but that of course they would have had a great view of the countryside and the surrounding area. That's a really good point. And I was just thinking to myself, so I imagine if you were asking for directions in medieval Tudor times, they'd say, yep, go straight ahead, turn at the cross. Like that's pretty handy. That's good.
Absolutely.
I like it. All right. So what do we know about how long Henry VII stayed at Waltham? Or like where he lodged? Do we know anything of that?
Not a lot. In fact, no. It's the short answer to that question.
Sad.
No on both points. So just going back to that line that we have, which just to reiterate was this, that the king rode to Waltham and thence the highway to Cambridge. So there's no information given about how long Henry VII stayed in Waltham or indeed where he lodged. And so, of course, that was the challenge. And now, if I can just sort of backpedal a little bit, I know, we share exactly the same process. We've been through so many of these before when we don't have a specific location. Well, what do you do with that? And so what we tend to do is we try to think about, okay, what would be the potential contenders? What are the possibilities? And we look for clues, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, first of all, there are limited possibilities. You've got a king and his entourage. You're going to be trying to look for properties of a particular size or status or wealth. That can help narrow things down. And then we might look at other factors. So, why were they there? Was there something specific they were going to see or do there? Maybe that would give us a clue. And the final thing is there a location that has what you and I call form? So I know you know what that means, Natalie.
Yeah, absolutely. Goodness. Yeah, I know from the past, I know exactly what you're saying, where we've generally looked to see if perhaps there'd been a previous royal visit where they'd stayed, because that's always a bit of a clue. So did you end up finding anything out?
Well, one of the secondary sources that we had available to us was a thesis by Clerkenwell called A Memoir of the Court of Henry VII, and that particular author suggests that Henry VII's visit to Waltham Abbey was devotional. And this makes a lot of sense given what we've already said about here. We've got a king trying to establish his authority and lineage, a king that was trying to show his divine right to rule. And here we have a very significant religious location. We've got the Holy Cross, a site of pilgrimage, a place where Henry VII could receive a blessing upon his kingship. And also, of course, as we well know, being an abbey, there was a long history of a place where, royalty might likely stay because, as we know, that very often when there was an abbey, there were lodgings, there was an abbot's lodgings, and not infrequently this would be a place where the royal family would stop on progress, and we know that from our experience in researching in the Footsteps books. So that's where I was interested, really. I was thinking, there's a big abbey, one of the most important, if not the most important Augustinian abbeys. We know it's got form, we know it's got history. What were the lodgings like? And my attention, of course, went immediately to the abbot's lodgings, because the abbot's lodgings was the most high status building in the abbey after the abbey church. So I started to see what I could find out. I mean, there's nothing there now. But I have to say, what I did find out completely took me by surprise.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So the inn was actually and I don't mean inn as in INN, I mean the inn to the story.
Oh, right.
was a story that I happened to stumble across about King Edward I and his Queen Eleanor, who we've already mentioned. Now, they loved Waltham Abbey, stayed there regularly, which was possibly why one of the reasons Eleanor's body was taken to rest at the Abbey. But they were staying there over one Easter time. And there's a story that the couple had been out hunting during the day. It had been a very vigorous day hunting. They came back to the Abbey. The king retired to his chambers. Already my ears are pricking up there.
That's right.
And he was therefore playfully assaulted afterwards by his queen and his ladies in a game that has been long lost to time called heaving. H-E-A-V-I-N-G. Yeah, yes, I know. It's interesting. Maybe we should resurrect this game. I don't know. Anyway, this seems to have been a tradition in which the king was basically taken prisoner and tied to a chair and released only when he agreed to the queen's terms. So anyway, it was a tradition. It was all taken in good part, and the story was amusing and interesting. But what really got my attention was the fact that there was a mention specifically of the royal chambers of the king close to the Abbey church.
That's interesting.
Very interesting. A bit of a breakthrough, because what that suggested, obviously to me, was that there were chambers, but these seemed to be reserved for the king, and they certainly felt as if they were part of the abbot's lodgings at that point to me.
Yeah, and the like you said, the abbot's lodgings are normally the place where we find royalty staying. And even after the dissolution, we find that those lodgings remain, which is also a big clue as to how high status they were. They're not going to just rip them down. They're going to keep them and transform them into an aristocratic house. And I love that story. I've never heard that story before with the heaving. There you go.
Maybe you could try that at home.
There's a new Christmas game, everyone.
Yes, listeners, heaving. Well, hold that thought about the abbot's lodgings, because you're quite right. And actually, it wasn't long after that I kind of got the clinching piece of evidence, really. I came across the inventory taken by the Court of the Augmentations, which was it was headed by Sir Richard Rich, and it was responsible for sort of the closure of the dissolution of the monasteries and what happened to all the property afterwards, etc. And the Abbey was dissolved, it's one of the last, if not the last, to be dissolved in 1540. And as we have actually seen before, an inventory was taken of the goods in the abbot's lodgings. And miraculously, the goods were listed by room.
Yes, there was so handy. I love that.
Isn't it wonderful? So what we hear of is a great hall, the abbot's outer parlour, an inner parlour. There's a great summer chamber and a corresponding winter chamber. We've got the abbot himself, but also specifically of interest to us, there is listed both a king and queen's chambers. And many different items in those chambers as well, carpets, wall hangings, bedsteads, etc. So this was a bit of a find, and I sort of felt I'd hit the jackpot. So at this point, we could certainly say that specific rooms were indeed reserved for royalty within the abbot's lodgings. And, you pointed out, Nat, there that often after the dissolution, if those lodgings were particularly prized, they were preserved in some way and converted into a king's manor or mansion. And we've seen that at places like Canterbury, Rochester, Dartford and York. Now, this is one bit of the research I'm still fertling around in to get the details, but I have definitely found out that post dissolution, there was a king's mansion on site, and Sir Anthony Denny, who was a member of the king's gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, was made keeper of that mansion. So it really suggests to me that there were royal lodgings there, and that they were still in use throughout the Tudor period. So
fantastic.
Yeah, the picture is building.
The picture is building. And so your thinking is that in line with the sort of traditional associated with the medieval kings, which has gone before him, Henry VII came to Waltham and lodged in the king's chamber, part of the abbot's lodgings within the monastic complex.
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, there's because we don't have the detail of Henry VII's progress, there's no way for us to establish absolutely definitively that was the case. Yeah. But given everything we know and that gut instinct, it feels that that's the most likely scenario to me.
Absolutely. And with Waltham being a traditional abbey, unlike St John's, I think we can even be more certain that they would have been in the abbot's lodgings, because the other lodgings would have been just too humble, really, for to welcome royalty, I suppose.
Yeah, good point.
So what are your feelings about Waltham Abbey now? Do you feel that you learned a lot from this? Or because I know we have looked at it before in one of our previous books, and we've been there, we've walked around together, we've talked to people, and it sounds like some new things have come up, and I'm kind of like, oh my goodness.
I know, but this happens, doesn't it? And this is why I think there's always something to learn. Whenever I think I've got it, there's always something else to learn. And I know we talked about Waltham Abbey in the foot, the Abbey at Waltham Abbey and the potential lodgings there. And it's also perhaps appropriate to say that out with the main abbot's lodgings, certainly by the time of Henry VIII, there was another small property just outside the monastic complex in an area called Romeland, which is thought to have been used by Henry VIII for his pleasure and disport. Let's not say much more than that.
Oh, I think heaving, Sarah.
Maybe. And it was in Romeland that famous conversation with Cranmer took place about how Henry might think about doing things differently in terms of getting his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. But can I just also mention what I also found out on my recent actual trip to Waltham was that the king had a permanent stables at Waltham Abbey, just to the south of the current market square. It was quite a significant building. And again, this just goes to show that, this was a significant royal lodging. So back to your question. Yes, it was incredibly exciting. And I'll tell you really why, because it became really clear to me that Waltham was not just a place that royalty just stopped from time to time, which I think was the impression that I sort of had before. No, this place was much more significant from that. It was almost like a royal citadel, and actually a royal citadel which has almost largely been forgotten, even by the local historians who are absolutely passionate about their history.
Yeah.
And I've been in conversation with them throughout this research process, and we've been, kind of enjoying building up the picture together. And I visited them a couple of weeks ago, met two members of the Historical Society, wonderful, wonderful people, totally committed to upholding their local history. And I think together we were saying as we wandered around that, St Lawrence, which is the parish church, once structurally part of the Abbey, the only part of the Abbey church that's left, and the Abbey Park, where the monastic complex and the abbot's lodgings was once sited. We were walking around, pulling all these pieces together, talking about it. And I think it just became apparent to all of us, that Waltham Abbey was so much more important to the itinerant medieval and Tudor court than any of us had ever kind of previously thought. And I suppose, ultimately what that showed to me is just how important it is to keep researching and talking about these places if we're going to preserve our past, because they can just so easily become a very faded and distant memory. So, lovely listeners, that brings us to the end of our first podcast in this series on Progress with the Tudors Uncut. So we've started our progress at the side of Henry VII as he makes his way north from London towards York in the spring of 1486. We've explored the Hospital of St John in London and the forgotten royal citadel of Waltham Abbey in Essex. So next time, when we rejoin the progress, we will continue our route north, exploring the next two stops on the progress. That's Cambridge and Huntingdon. In the meantime, if you want to get involved in talking about this progress, please do head on over to Facebook and search for On Progress with the Tudors Uncut. You can request to join our members-only group, where we are happy to take your questions, listen to your comments and hear any other snippets of information that you might have about the two locations we've been talking about today. As we said earlier, we know there are lots of you out there who love your history, and maybe you can throw some more light on the places we are researching and maybe even change the course of our research itself. So, first of all, thank you to Natalie for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah. It's been so much fun, and I better get cracking on that next location.
Yes, I know. Who knows what we'll find? And thank you, lovely listeners, for joining us today. So until next time.